To be born into old money is to inherit a kind of armor. The grand jury will believe you. The lawyers will sit beside you. The newspapers will agree, by quiet arrangement, to say very little. And when your husband is found dead in the hallway of your own house, the system will protect you. Ann Woodward proved every part of that promise on the night of the 30th of October, 1955. She fired the shotgun. She walked out of the courthouse a free woman. And then she discovered, very slowly, that there was a second machine. And the second machine was the one that killed her. If you find yourself drawn to the human stories the history books tend to keep out, hit subscribe so the next of them comes straight to you, because the second machine is the one old money has always preferred to keep quiet. Chapter 1. The Streetcar Conductor's Daughter. Long before she became the most famous suspect in American old money, she was a small girl in Pittsburgh, Kansas, who learned never to belong anywhere. She was born Angeline Lucille Crowell on the 12th of June, 1915. The town was a coal town in the southeast corner of the state, the kind of place built on three industries that were beginning to fade even then: mining and railroads and the small businesses that fed both. Her father, George Crowell, was a streetcar conductor. He worked the line that ran from the center of Pittsburgh out to the smaller towns east of it, in a uniform that was perhaps 3 years old by the time of her birth, and that he wore until it would not hold a crease any longer. He was a quiet man. People who knew him in those years described him as decent, restrained, and tired. Her mother left. The details are not in the public record, but Angeline grew up with the fact of the leaving as the central architecture of her childhood. She was raised in large part by her grandmother, in a wood frame house that the family did not own, in a part of town where the children of conductors and miners and mechanics played in the same dirt streets and went to the same school. She wore other children's dresses. She was bright. Teachers in Pittsburgh later remembered her as quick, attentive, and unusually careful about the way she presented herself for a girl whose family had so little. She also, by the age of 12, had begun the long, careful work of leaving. There is a story told later by relatives, perhaps apocryphal, that she kept a notebook under her bed in which she wrote out names she might use one day instead of her own. The names were Eden, Aubrey, Lake, and several others. She practiced her signature. She studied magazines. By her own later admission to a friend in Manhattan, she had decided, before she had finished school, that she would not be Angeline Crowell from Pittsburgh for the rest of her life. The mechanism of escape, in 1930s Kansas, was radio. The medium was new enough that voices from outside the established theater and film world could find an audience. By the age of 17, Angeline had walked the 4 blocks from her grandmother's house to the offices of a local station and asked to be heard. She read advertising copy. She read romance scripts. She had, by all accounts, an unusually clear, slightly low voice that recorded well. Within a year, she had moved to Kansas City and was working at a larger station there. By the time she was 18, she had legally adopted the stage name Ann Eden. Ann Eden was not Angeline Crowell. Ann Eden had been born in California, she said, to a family of modest but respectable means. Ann Eden had attended a small private school. Ann Eden had grown up around horses. None of this was true. All of it was useful. Each detail closed a door behind her in Pittsburgh and opened a different one in front of her. The studio executives in Kansas City believed her, or did not care, and within 2 years she had moved again, this time to Chicago, where her voice was being heard on syndicated radio dramas. What Chicago taught her was that there was nothing to keep her in the Midwest. She knew it. She had known it since the notebook under the bed. By 1940, when she was 24, she had taken her radio income and her 2 trunks of clothes, including one dress purchased on layaway over 6 months, and bought a one-way train ticket to Manhattan. She arrived in New York on a humid afternoon in the spring of that year, walked out of Grand Central Terminal, and looked up at the buildings and said something that she later quoted to a young writer who would betray her 35 years later. She said, "There is more sky here." She meant the opposite of what the words seemed to mean. She meant that here, finally, there was room for the woman she had been preparing to be. She did not yet know on that humid afternoon the name of the family she would marry into. She did not yet know that the New York she had arrived in was already in its way beginning to close. The old order would still receive a beautiful new face for a few more years. But by the time she was Mrs. William Woodward Jr., the receiving had become harder. and the order had become more watchful. Pittsburgh, Kansas was very far behind her now. So was Ann Eden. The notebook under the bed had finally run out of names. Within 3 years, she would not need any of them. She would have a husband's name, and she would discover that a husband's name, the right husband's name, was the only name in New York that mattered. But the letter she carried with her on the train from the radio executive in Chicago, who had given her one introduction in Manhattan, would change everything. Chapter 2. A Showgirl at El Morocco. By 27, she had reinvented herself 3 times, and the 4th reinvention was about to walk through the door of New York's most famous nightclub. The Manhattan she arrived in the spring of 1940, was a city in which a beautiful young woman with a clear speaking voice and good carriage could still find a series of doors to open without too much difficulty. The modeling agencies on Madison Avenue, the radio agencies on Broadway, the nightclub bookers who worked the Stork Club, and the Copacabana and the small cluster of rooms below Fifth Avenue, all of them passed names back and forth. Ann Eden had 2 introductions, one from her Chicago station and one from a New York radio actor she had met at a dinner. Within 6 months, she was making, by her own later accounts, between $40 and $60 a week, the equivalent of perhaps $800 to $1,200 a week today. She worked first as a model. The work was sporadic. She posed for magazine advertisements, for catalogs, for 1 or 2 of the cigarette campaigns of the period. The income was uneven. She lived first in a single room on West 57th Street, then in a slightly better apartment on East 54th Street. By the late summer of 1940, she had taken a second job as a showgirl at Fifi's Monte Carlo, a small upscale club on East 54th Street that drew a Wall Street and Broadway clientele. The showgirl life of the period was not what later popular culture has remembered it as. It was unglamorous, badly paid, and physically exhausting. The girls began at perhaps 8 in the evening, dressed, made up, and arranged at the doors and at the tables of the room throughout the night until perhaps 3 or 4 in the morning. They were paid by the hour. They were also paid sometimes in tips from the men who passed them business cards. The girls who were ambitious, and Ann Eden was certainly ambitious, learned within their first month which clients were married, which clients were single, which clients had family money, and which clients merely had jobs. They learned to read a watch. They learned to read a suit. By 1941, Ann had moved up to the Copacabana, which was the most fashionable of the larger New York nightclubs, owned by Monty Proser and run by Jack Entratter, who would later run the Sands in Las Vegas. The Copacabana drew a more visible clientele than Fefe's, a mix of Broadway producers, Wall Street partners, and the younger members of the old New York families who came out for the floor shows. Ann was, by the spring of 1942, a regular face at the Copacabana, working 3 or 4 nights a week and supplementing her income with modeling work in the days. She had also, in this period, made one mistake that she did not later acknowledge in public. She had married a man named Crittenden in 1941. The marriage was very brief, perhaps 6 months, perhaps less. The records survive in the Manhattan civil files, but the press never reported it at the time of her later marriage. Crittenden, by accounts of those who knew the marriage, was a salesman, decent enough, not wealthy. Ann had married him in a moment of insecurity in her first New York year, and had left him almost immediately when she understood that the marriage closed more doors than it opened. The legal severance was quiet. She did not mention it. The night that changed her life was, by every account that survived, an autumn evening at El Morocco in the late summer of 1942. El Morocco was the rival to the Stork Club, decorated in zebra stripes by John Perona, and was the kind of room in which the younger sons of the great families came to dance. Ann Eden was there, as a guest of a Wall Street friend. The young naval officer at the next table was William Woodward Jr., on leave from his ship, 22 years old, in his navy whites, with his hair freshly cut. He saw her. She saw him. He came over. Billy Woodward had a face that the New York Times Society pages would later describe as boyish and pleasant. He had grown up at the Buckley School, then Groton, then Harvard. He had been, until his enlistment in the Navy in 1941, the heir presumptive to a banking and racing fortune that placed him among perhaps 300 families in America. He was the kind of young man who, in New York in 1942, did not need to introduce himself by his last name. The bartender knew him. The maitre d' knew him. The doorman at El Morocco had been told to look out for him as a personal favor to Jock Whitney. Within 3 months of that evening at El Morocco, Billy was telling his closest Harvard friends that he intended to marry her. Within 5, he had met her grandmother, briefly on a trip out west. Within 6, he had told his mother. His mother was Elsie Cryder Woodward. His mother was the gatekeeper of one of the most closely held social circles in the country. His mother, when she was told who Ann was, sent for a private investigator from a firm her husband's family had used for 40 years and ordered a complete report. The report came back within 3 weeks. It contained the name Angeline Lucille Crowell. It contained the streetcar conductor father. It contained the absent mother. It contained the radio station in Kansas City. It contained the Copacabana. It contained the salesman husband Crittenden. It contained the change of legal name in Chicago in 1934. Elsie read the report once, then twice, and then she went into Billy's bedroom on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1943 and told him, in a voice he had not heard from her since he was very small, that this woman was not for him. Billy, perhaps for the first time in his life, did not do what his mother told him to do. He told her that he was going to marry Ann anyway. He told her that the report did not change his mind. He told her that he loved her. Elsie looked at him in a long silence, the kind of silence that mothers of her generation had perfected. And then she said the only thing she would say to him about it for the rest of her life. She said, "Very well." And then she began the long, quiet work of making sure that the woman her son brought into the family would never be allowed inside it. Chapter 3. The wedding society refused to announce. There was no notice in the New York Times. That silence was its own kind of speech. The wedding of William Woodward Jr. to Ann Eden took place on the 17th of June, 1943. It was a small ceremony. It was held in a friend's apartment in Manhattan. The officiant was not the Woodward family clergyman. The witnesses were 2 of Billy's Navy friends and one of Ann's friends from the Copacabana, a young woman who would not be invited again to a Woodward function for the rest of her life. Elsie did not attend. Billy's sisters did not attend. Billy's grandfather, William Woodward Sr., then president of the Central Hanover Bank and Trust Company and one of the dominant figures in American thoroughbred racing, did not attend. A Woodward wedding without the Woodwards was a statement that the family had decided to make in the only language available to it. In 1943 Manhattan, the announcement of an engagement and the announcement of a wedding in the society columns of the New York Times, the New York Herald Tribune, and the columns of Charlie Knickerbocker were the moments at which a family ratified its new member in public. The announcement was placed by the bride's family. It was confirmed by the groom's family. It listed the schools attended, the clubs joined, the lineages on both sides. The omission of the announcement in 1943 Manhattan was understood by everyone who read those pages to mean that one family had not agreed. The Woodwards did not agree. Elsie did not agree. The omission was deliberate. It was Elsie's first public statement about her son's wife, made by silence, the form of statement she preferred for the rest of her life. To understand the depth of the snub, you have to understand the structure of the world Ann Eden had just walked into. The Social Register of New York in 1943 contained perhaps 3,400 families. The register was not a curated guide for tourists. It was the operating manual of the closed society of the Eastern American seaboard. To be in the register was to be invited. To be out of it was to be invisible. The register was edited by a small staff in a building on East 75th Street. It was reissued each November. It contained addresses, summer residences, club memberships, marriages, divorces, and a great many small markings of social standing that the casual reader would miss. Elsie Cryder Woodward, born 1883, was at the center of this system. She had been one of the famously beautiful Cryder triplets at the turn of the century, painted by John Singer Sargent in one of the best-known portraits of the period. Anne married into the Woodwards in 1904. By 1943, she had been a Woodward for 39 years. She had presided over Bel Air Mansion in Maryland and over the Woodward House in New York. She had raised 4 children, of whom Billy was the youngest and the only son. She had buried her husband, William Woodward. Sr. would die in 1953, but in 1943 he was still alive, and she was still very much married. She knew everyone. She decided everything. Her power was the power of the dispatcher of cards. She decided whose calling card was accepted at her door. She decided who came to her table at the Colony restaurant on East 61st Street. She decided whose engagement she acknowledged with a written note and whose she did not. She had, in the careful conduct of 40 years inside the social register, perfected the polite no. She did not need to refuse out loud. She refused by not noticing. She refused by not inviting. She refused by not mentioning. The polite no, repeated patiently across years, could end a woman's life in New York. She turned this power onto Ann Woodward in the summer of 1943 and did not turn it off for the next 32 years. Ann did not at first fully understand what was happening to her. She was 27 years old. She was newly married to a man she loved and who loved her. She had a townhouse at 105 East 93rd Street. She had a husband whose family fortune was estimated, in the social columns of the day, at between $10 and $12 million. She had a name. The name was Mrs. William Woodward Jr. She wore it carefully. She bought the right clothes. She arranged the right small dinners. She wrote the right notes. She did all of the work that a young society wife in 1943 was expected to do. What she discovered slowly over the first year of the marriage was that the work did not produce the expected results. The invitations came. They came from the second tier of the social register, from the families who were eager to receive any Woodward at any cost. The invitations did not come from the first tier. The first tier was the world that Elsie controlled. The first tier did not send. The first tier did not come. When Ann hosted, Elsie's friends sent polite notes regretting that they could not attend. When Elsie hosted, Ann's name was not on the list. The dinners that Ann attended in her first years were attended by people Elsie did not consider important. The dinners that Elsie attended were attended by Vincent Astor, by Mrs. Cornelius Vanderbilt, by Mrs. Henry Phipps, by the people whose names had been in the register for 50 years or more. Ann saw the gap and tried to close it. She wrote letters, she made visits, she arranged charitable committee work. The gap stayed open. Elsie kept it open. In 1944, the first son was born. He was named William Woodward III. He was the heir. He was, in family terms, the most important thing Ann had so far produced. Elsie came to the hospital. Elsie did not stay. She returned home to East 72nd Street and did not see the baby again for several weeks. She let it be understood, by the kind of small silences that the society columns understood how to read, that the child was a Woodward, but the mother was not. In 1947, the second son was born. He was named James. He was, by the convention of the family, the spare. Elsie came to the hospital. Elsie did not stay. The pattern was set. By the early 1950s, Ann had begun to drink. Billy had been drinking for years. The marriage continued. The two sons grew. The townhouse on East 93rd Street and the country house at Oyster Bay Cove were maintained at the proper standard. The boxes at the Belmont Stakes were filled with the proper guests. From the outside, in the columns of Charlie Knickerbocker, the Woodward marriage looked exactly like the kind of marriage the social register expected of its members. From the inside, the marriage was a quiet decade-long siege, and the siege was being run not by an enemy outside, but by the mother in the next room of the next house down the block. The shotgun in the hallway of the Playhouse was 12 years away. The grand jury that would not indict her was 12 years away. The advance copy of Esquire was 32 years away. All of it had been set in motion on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1943, when Elsie Cryder Woodward had read a private investigator's report once, then twice, and then had told her son very well. Chapter 4. 12 years inside Elsie's house. She lived as a Woodward, dressed as a Woodward, raised two Woodwards, and was never once allowed to be a Woodward. The decade from 1943 to 1953 was the long marriage. It was also the long siege. To understand what happened in October of 1955 at the Playhouse, you have to understand what 12 years of polite refusal does to a woman who has reinvented herself 3 times and arrived at the place she always meant to arrive. Ann Woodward in those years lived inside the social register at the address marked Mrs. William Woodward Jr. She also lived inside Elsie's quiet, permanent disapproval. The two addresses occupied the same physical rooms. The address marked Mrs. William Woodward Jr. had a precise structure. There was the townhouse at 105 East 93rd Street. There was the Playhouse at Oyster Bay Cove on Long Island, the family country place built in the 1920s on a lawn that ran down to the Sound. There was the box at the Belmont Stakes. There was the box at Saratoga in August. There was the suite at the Breakers in Palm Beach in February. There was the Maine Boucher account for evening clothes. There was the John Fredericks account for hats. There was the Cartier account, the Tiffany account, the Bergdorf account. There was, behind everything else, the Woodward family income, which by Ann's own later accounts ran between $150,000 and $250,000 a year in those years, the equivalent of perhaps $1.5 to $2.5 million annually today. The address marked Elsie's disapproval had a different structure. Elsie's drawing room on East 72nd Street, which Ann visited perhaps 4 times a year, each time at Elsie's invitation, never her own. The Christmas table at Bel Air Mansion in Maryland, where Ann was seated at the far end near the children, never near Elsie. The Easter service at St. Bartholomew's on Park Avenue, where Ann walked in slightly behind her husband and slightly ahead of nobody. The summer afternoons in Newport, where Ann had been told by her sister-in-law, in a voice meant to be helpful, that the Bailey's Beach Club was not for her. The small dinners at the Colony Club, which Elsie attended and Ann did not. The annual cotillion at the Astor House, which Ann had attended exactly once. The 2 addresses were the same set of rooms. They contained the same chairs, the same paintings, the same chandeliers. They were occupied by the same people. The difference was in the temperature. At the address marked Mrs. William Woodward Jr., the temperature was the proper 24 degrees Celsius, and the conversation was the proper light social weather of the period. At the address marked Elsie's disapproval, which began approximately 1/2 centimeter behind the surface of every conversation, the temperature was several degrees colder. Ann adapted. She had been adapting since the notebook under the bed in Pittsburgh. She adapted to the second address by working twice as hard at the first. She filled the East 93rd Street house with the right flowers. She kept the engagement book in her own hand. She arranged the Belmont weekend with the precision of a cabinet meeting. She wrote her thank you notes the day she returned home. She bought, each season, the dress that the older women would notice and approve of, never the dress that would make her stand out. She bought, each spring, the new pair of pearls that confirmed she understood the conventions. She dressed her sons, when they were small, in the same clothes Billy had worn as a child, ordered from the same English maker. She did the work. The work had a limit. The limit was Elsie. By 1950, when she had been married for 7 years, Ann had begun to understand that the limit was permanent. She did not write to her grandmother in Kansas about it. Her grandmother had died in 1947. She did not have, in New York, the kind of friends she could have spoken to about it. The Copacabana friends had been gently moved out of her life. The Mrs. Woodward Jr. friends did not invite the conversation. She had Billy. Billy understood. Billy did not act. Billy never acted. She also, in this period, had begun to drink. The drinking was not yet visible at the parties. The drinking was at home. The drinking was in the afternoons before the dinners. The drinking was the small medicinal glass of brandy that became the second glass and the third. By 1952, Billy was drinking more heavily than she was. By 1953, the staff at the Playhouse had been quietly trained by Ann's housekeeper to watch for both of them and to keep the children in another part of the house. In May of 1953, William Woodward Sr. died. He was 87 years old. He had been the chairman of the Central Hanover Bank and Trust Company. He had owned Gallant Fox, the 1930 Triple Crown winner. He had owned Omaha, the 1935 Triple Crown winner. He had been the great public figure of the Woodward family. His death changed everything for Billy, and therefore for Ann. Billy became, at the age of 33, the head of the Woodward family. He inherited control of the Bel Air stud thoroughbred operation. He inherited the principal share of the family trusts. He inherited the seat on the board of the Central Hanover Bank, which he held with no particular interest in banking. He inherited the public expectation that he would now appear, with his wife, at the proper occasions, at the front, as the next generation of the family. He inherited, in other words, the responsibility he had been deferring to his grandfather for a decade. He was not equal to it. He drank harder. The marriage tightened. Ann, for the first time in 7 years, became a slightly more visible figure in the columns of the period. As the wife of the new head of the family, she was photographed in 1953 at the Saratoga Sales, at the Belmont Stakes, at the Bailey's Beach Club in Newport, from which she had once been told she was excluded. She wore, in those photographs, a small smile that looked like a victory. It was not a victory. Elsie was still there. Elsie was now a widow. Elsie was, by every measure of social power, more powerful than she had been before her husband's death, not less. Widowhood, at the top of the New York Social Register in 1953, was not a retirement. It was a promotion. Elsie watched her daughter-in-law's slightly increased visibility with the patience of a woman who had waited 10 years already and could wait 10 more. She invited Anne to no more drawing rooms than she had invited her to before. She placed her at no closer place at the dinner table. She wrote no warmer notes. She did, in the autumn of 1953, attend a single function at the East 93rd Street house, the small Christmas tea for the children. She arrived at 4:30. She left at 5. The columnist who reported it did not understand what the 30-minute visit had meant. Anne understood. Billy understood. The staff understood. By 1954, the marriage was in a state that the staff at the Playhouse were beginning to call, among themselves, the season. The season was Anne's bad weeks, when the drinking was at the highest level and the fights with Billy were at the loudest. The season would last between 2 and 4 weeks, would subside, and would return a few months later. The pattern was visible to anyone in the house. It was not visible in the press. By the spring of 1955, Billy was openly seeing the young European model Marina Haab. The affair had begun, by the most reliable accounts, in 1954 at a yachting weekend in the south of France. Haab was the daughter of a Hungarian Jewish writer who had escaped to America during the war, and she was working at the time as a fashion model in Paris and Milan. She was 20 years old. She was strikingly beautiful, dark-haired, slim, and well-educated. She did not pretend to be anything she was not. She was, by every account of those who knew her, kind. Billy was 34. He had been married to Anne for 12 years. Anne discovered the affair in the early summer of 1955, in the conventional way, through a friend. She confronted Billy. He admitted it. He told her that he would end it. He did not end it. He continued to see Marina Haab through the summer of that year. Anne's drinking increased. Her arguments with Billy increased. The staff at the Playhouse began, for the first time, to record in their own private notebooks the dates of the worst evenings. The pattern of those summer weeks would become important later, in a quiet, unrecorded way, to the Nassau County grand jury that would not indict her in December of that year. In late September of 1955, Billy went to Chicago for Nashua's match race against Swaps. He took Anne. They were photographed together at Washington Park. Nashua won by 6.5 lengths. The purse was $100,000, the largest single-race purse in American history to that point. Billy walked into the winner's circle. The photograph that survives, the one that ran on the front page of the New York Times the next morning, shows him smiling for the first time in months. Anne is at his elbow. She is not smiling. She is looking at the camera with the small, careful expression of a woman whose marriage is in a season she does not know how to end. By the time they returned to Long Island in the first week of October 1955, Billy had bought 2 new shotguns. There had been a series of burglaries in the area. He told Anne to keep one of the shotguns in her bedroom. He told her, in case of an intruder in the night, that she should call out, and that if there was no answer, she should shoot. He kept the other shotgun in his own bedroom across the hall. He had instructed her on how to use it. She knew how to load it. She knew how to fire it. The instruction had been given on a Friday afternoon in early October, the 7th, in the upstairs hallway of the Playhouse, with the children in the next room. The Duchess of Windsor was due for dinner 3 weeks later. Marina Haab was, by Billy's account to his Wall Street friends, no longer his concern. Anne was, by her own account to her one trusted friend, no longer sure of anything Billy had told her. The shotguns were loaded. The marriage was in its 12th year. The mother-in-law on East 72nd Street was waiting, as she had been waiting since 1943. Gilded, Chapter 5. Nashua and the Shotgun. In the autumn of 1955, the Woodward name was on the front pages for racing and on the back pages for an affair. The two halves of the autumn of 1955 sat next to each other in the columns of every newspaper Ann Woodward read. On the front pages, in the racing sections, the Woodward family was at the height of its public power. Nashua, the colt Billy had inherited the management of from his grandfather, was on the verge of the kind of season that placed an owner in the history books permanently. On the back pages, in the columns that the Woodward staff cut out and folded into the breakfast tray, the rumors about Billy and Marina Haab in Europe had not died. They had been moved by the quiet hand of the columnists from the front of the columns to the back, but they had not been removed. The racing season Nashua produced in 1955 had begun in May at Churchill Downs. He had run a strong second in the Kentucky Derby behind Swaps, the Californian colt who was being talked about as the next great horse in American racing. The defeat had stung Billy. Nashua had come back 2 weeks later to win the Preakness Stakes at Pimlico. 3 weeks after that, in early June, Nashua had won the Belmont Stakes by a length. By July, he had won the Dwyer at Aqueduct. By August, he had won the Arlington Classic in Chicago. By September, the American racing press was calling for a match race, owner against owner, horse against horse, Nashua against Swaps, to settle once and for all which colt was the better. The race was set for the 31st of August at Washington Park outside Chicago. It was run as a single race, 1 mile and a quarter, with a purse of $100,000, the largest single race purse in American history to that point. The race was carried live on national radio and on the new medium of national television. The audience was estimated at the time at 12 million people. Billy and Ann traveled out to Chicago by private train. They stayed at the Drake. Billy was photographed at every step of the trip in a way he had not been since his Navy years. Nashua won by 6.5 lengths. He never trailed. The Californian colt, Swaps, had a bruised hoof that Billy's camp would later say had been hidden by Swap's trainer, Mish Tenney, before the race. The argument about the soundness of Swap's hoof would continue in racing magazines for 30 years. None of it altered the result. Nashua had won. Billy walked into the winner's circle in a gray suit and accepted the trophy from the chairman of Washington Park. The photograph ran on the front page of every American paper. The Woodward family, 50 years after William Woodward Sr. had begun building Bel Air Stud in Maryland, had produced its third Triple Crown caliber horse and its single most famous victory. Ann was in the photograph at Billy's elbow. She had bought a new hat for the occasion. The photograph from the Chicago Tribune, which is the one most often reproduced, shows her looking up at her husband with a small, tight, almost defensive expression. She had been informed the previous week in New York by a friend who had recently returned from Europe that Marina Haab was still in the picture. She had said nothing to Billy about the new information. She had bought the hat and the dress and the gloves and had gone to Chicago in the train and had stood beside her husband in the winner's circle. By every account that survived, this was the strategy Ann had decided on in the brief season of her marriage that began with Nashua's match race and ended with the dinner for the Duchess of Windsor 8 weeks later. The strategy was endurance. The Marina Haab affair had begun, as we have seen, on a yachting trip to the south of France in 1954. By the summer of 1955, it was the open subject of the European columns. The Paris columnists had photographed Billy with Haab at a restaurant on the Rue de Castiglione. The London columnists had reported him with Haab at a weekend at a country house in Wiltshire. The New York columnists, who had not yet been entirely converted to the new style of celebrity disclosure that Capote would help to introduce 2 decades later, had been politely vague. They had referred to Billy's bachelor period in Europe in the summer. They had not mentioned Haab by name. They had not needed to. Everyone who read the columns knew the name. Ann certainly knew it. By the late summer of 1955, the staff at the Playhouse knew it. Billy returned from Europe in the second week of September 1955, 3 weeks before the Nashua match race, and told Ann the affair was over. He told her this in their bedroom at the Playhouse on a Saturday afternoon. He told her he had ended it because he had thought about it for a long time and decided that the marriage was the important thing. He told her that he loved her. He did not tell her that he had also told Marina Haab in the same week that he loved her too and would return to her in Paris in November. The two statements were not necessarily contradictory in Billy's mind. They were the kind of statements a man makes when he does not know how to choose. Ann accepted his account on the Saturday afternoon. By the Monday morning, she had begun to doubt it. By the Friday, she had stopped believing it. She did not confront him again. She had decided on endurance. The prowler problem in Oyster Bay Cove was real. It is important to be precise about this because the prowler became, 3 weeks later, the legal cover for everything that happened. There had been 5 documented burglaries in the area in the previous 3 months. 3 of them had been within a mile of the Woodward property. The Locust Valley Police had a description of a young man in his early 20s who was working houses on the North Shore. They believed he was an escapee from a youth detention facility in upstate New York. They had not yet identified him. They would identify him in November, 10 days after Billy's death, as Paul Wirths, 22 years old, of no fixed address. Wirths would later confirm to the Nassau County Police that he had been on the Woodward property on the night of the 30th of October. He would not, however, ever say he entered the house. Billy's reaction to the burglary reports was the reaction of a husband of his class in 1955. He bought 2 new shotguns. He bought them at the Abercrombie & Fitch Sporting Department on Madison Avenue. They were Holland Holland 12-gauge double barrels. He brought them home to the Playhouse on a Friday afternoon, the 7th of October. He took Ann into the upstairs hallway. He showed her how to load. He showed her how to break the action. He showed her how to fire. He told her, with the door of his own bedroom open and the door of her bedroom open, that if she heard anything in the night she should call out, and that if there was no answer, she should shoot. He repeated the instruction. He repeated it more than once. The instruction was witnessed by the children's nanny, Marjorie Fagan, who was passing in the hall. The shotguns were kept loaded, 1 in Billy's bedroom, 1 in Ann's bedroom. The 2 bedrooms were across the hallway from each other, on the 2nd floor of the Playhouse, with the children's rooms a short distance further down the hall. The doors of the 2 bedrooms opened onto the same upstairs corridor. The corridor was carpeted. The corridor was approximately 2 meters wide. From the door of Ann's bedroom to the door of Billy's bedroom was a distance of perhaps 3 meters. The shotgun in Ann's bedroom, when loaded and broken, was leant against the wall to the left of her door. A child could have lifted it. A frightened woman with 12-gauge shells in both barrels could have lifted it without thought. The dinner for the Duke and Duchess of Windsor had been planned for the 30th of October, a Sunday evening, 3 weeks after the shotguns had been bought. The Duke and Duchess were the great society guests of any American autumn. Their availability was secured by Elsie's social network for Billy and Ann's house at Oyster Bay Cove. The guest list ran to 12 people: the British ambassador, Sir Roger Makins, and his wife, the Wall Street partner, George Baker, and his wife, 2 or 3 other Wall Street couples, 1 or 2 friends of Ann's from the social circuit, the Duke and Duchess themselves. The menu had been settled. The seating had been settled. Anne had bought a new dress in Paris in the late summer, before the Marina news. She had been planning to wear it. The morning of the 30th of October, 1955, began at the Playhouse with the usual rhythm. The children were taken out by Marjorie Fagan to a friend's farm for the day. Billy went out to ride at 11. Anne supervised the table arrangements with the housekeeper. The flowers arrived. The Duchess of Windsor's particular preference for white tulips had been accommodated. Anne took a small glass of brandy at 3:30 in the afternoon. She took another at 5. She bathed and dressed for dinner. Billy, returning from his ride, did the same. They did not speak to each other between 4 and 7 that afternoon. The guests began to arrive at 7:30. The dinner was served at 8:30. By every account from the guests who survived to be interviewed in later years, the dinner was a great success. The Duchess was charming. The food was perfect. The Duke was pleased. Anne was pleased. Billy was pleased. The guests left between 11 and 11:30. By midnight, the house had emptied. Billy and Anne had gone up to their separate bedrooms. The staff had begun the cleaning. The children were asleep. The shotguns were in the bedrooms where they had been since the 7th of October. The hallway lights were turned off at 1 in the morning. By 2:30 in the morning, Billy Woodward Jr. was dead on the floor of the upstairs hallway of his own house. Chapter 6. The Dinner for the Duchess. The most coveted house guest in America had come and gone. By 3 in the morning, her husband was dead in his own hallway. What follows is the part of the story for which we have the most contested accounts. There were 2 people in the upstairs hallway of the Playhouse at the moment the shotgun was fired. One of them died within minutes. The other one gave her account to the Nassau County Police 3 times in the next 4 days. Each of those accounts was consistent in its main features and slightly different in its small details. The accounts that survive from the staff who were elsewhere in the house at the moment of the shot are the only other witnesses. They were not in the hallway. Anne's account was this. She had gone to bed at perhaps 1:15 midnight after the guests had left. She had taken her sleeping medication. She had heard her husband in the bathroom. She had heard him return to his own bedroom. She had not spoken to him since the guests had left. She had been falling asleep when she became aware of a noise on the gravel outside. She had risen, gone to her window, looked out. She had seen what she believed to be a man's figure on the lawn. She had been frightened. She had remembered the shotgun. She had loaded it. She had also, by her account, called out. She had said her husband's name. She had said it twice. She had received no reply. She had opened her bedroom door, the shotgun raised, and had seen at the far end of the hallway a figure moving. She had fired. The figure had fallen. She had reached for the light switch on the wall. She had turned the light on. The figure on the floor was her husband. The Nassau County detectives who took Anne's account in the dawn hours of the 31st of October found her in a state of physical collapse on the floor of the upstairs hallway next to her husband's body. The shotgun was lying perhaps 2 meters from her, in the position of having been dropped. Billy was naked. He had been hit at close range with both barrels. He had taken the shot in the chest and the head. He had bled extensively. He was beyond resuscitation. The first medical examiner to arrive declared him dead at 4 in the morning. The official time of death was set at 2:37 in the morning, the time at which the staff downstairs had heard the shot. The staff who heard the shot were the housekeeper, Mrs. Rogers, and the butler, Mr. Crawford. They were in the kitchen at the back of the ground floor. The shot came from above and behind them. Mrs. Rogers later told the police that she had heard 1 shot, not 2, although the medical evidence later established that both barrels had been fired. She had thought, in the half-second after the shot, that something heavy had fallen upstairs. Mr. Crawford had said the same. They had run to the foot of the staircase. They had called up. They had heard Anne's voice. Anne had been saying her husband's name. They had run up. They had found her on her knees beside Billy. The Nassau County detectives, led by Captain Hubert Bauer, took the scene with the professional care that the death of a man of Billy Woodward's class required in 1955. They photographed the body. They photographed the hallway. They photographed the position of the shotgun. They photographed the broken glass at a service entrance at the back of the house, which would later be matched to Paul Wirths' identifiable shoe prints on the lawn. They took Anne's account 3 times in 4 days. They sealed the upstairs hallway. They took the shotgun into evidence. They took the second shotgun, which had remained in Billy's bedroom, also into evidence. They did the work the period required. What the detectives could not record, because it was not within the scope of their work, was the sequence of small choices that had produced the shot. Anne had taken her sleeping medication. She had been drinking. She had been, by her own later account to her doctor in Switzerland, in a state of anxiety she did not fully understand for the previous week. She had heard a noise. She had taken the shotgun. She had walked to her door. She had opened the door. She had seen a figure in the hallway. She had not said her husband's name a 3rd time. She had fired. The figure was her husband. The question that the grand jury would later have to consider was whether all of those small choices were the choices of a woman who had genuinely mistaken her husband for an intruder, or whether they were the choices of a woman who had used a real intruder elsewhere on the property as the cover for an act that was not really about the intruder at all. The grand jury, in the end, would believe the first reading. Elsie would believe the second. Capote, 2 decades later, would write the second. Anne's lawyer arrived at the Playhouse at perhaps 6:30 in the morning. He had been called by Mrs. Rogers. He was Sol Rosenblatt, of the firm of Rosenblatt & Wall, the family's primary New York attorney. He was a senior figure in New York legal society. He had been the personal lawyer of William Woodward Sr. He had known Billy since Billy was a boy. He had not approved of the marriage to Anne, but he had not opposed it publicly. He arrived at the Playhouse, was shown to the upstairs hallway by Captain Bauer, took one look at the body, and walked downstairs to telephone Elsie Cryder Woodward in Manhattan. Elsie took the telephone in her drawing room on East 72nd Street at perhaps 6:45 in the morning. She was not yet dressed. She had been awake since 6 in the way of women of her generation. She listened to Sol Rosenblatt for perhaps 2 minutes. She asked one question. She asked whether the children had been in the house. Sol Rosenblatt told her the children had been at a friend's farm. Elsie said, "Very well." And then she said, in a voice that Sol Rosenblatt would later quote to one of his partners but never to a journalist, "You will defend her." The decision, in those 4 words, was the central social decision of the next 20 years of New York history. Elsie Cryder Woodward, who had hated Anne for 12 years, who had refused her, who had withheld her, who had let her live as a Woodward without ever being a Woodward, made the decision on the telephone before she had finished her first cup of coffee that the family would close ranks around the woman she believed had killed her son. She made the decision because of the 2 boys at the friend's farm. She made the decision because no Woodward grandchild would grow up as the child of a convicted murderess. She made the decision because the protective machinery and the destructive machinery were the same machinery, and Elsie understood exactly how to run both at the same time. By 7:30 in the morning, the wheels of the protective machinery were turning. Sol Rosenblatt had called the 2 senior partners of the firm. They had called the Nassau County District Attorney. They had called the New York Times. By 8 in the morning, the press release was being drafted. By 9, the first version of the official family account, which would be the account Anne gave the police, the account the grand jury heard, the account every newspaper printed, had been agreed in outline. Anne had been in fear of a prowler. Anne had called out. There had been no answer. Anne had fired in the belief that she was protecting her home. Anne had then turned on the light and discovered, to her terrible grief, that the figure was her husband. The account had the virtue of being approximately true. The prowler was real. The shotgun had been bought for the prowler. Anne had been afraid. The grief, by every account from those who saw her in the next 48 hours, was real. The account contained one small omission. The omission concerned how often she had called out and what had passed in her mind between calling out and pulling the triggers. The omission was the only part of the story that mattered. Elsie understood the omission. Sol Rosenblatt understood it. The grand jury would not be invited to consider it. By 9 in the morning of the 31st of October, 1955, the New York Times had been informed that William Woodward Jr. was dead. By 10, the first paragraph of the next morning's front-page story had been drafted. By 11, the first reporters were on the road from Manhattan to Oyster Bay Cove. By noon, the family's official statement, which was the statement Elsie and Sol Rosenblatt had agreed at 8, was being typed onto carbon paper in the offices of Rosenblatt and Wall on Wall Street. By 2 in the afternoon, Ann Woodward had been moved from the Playhouse to a private wing of the Manhattan Eye and Ear Hospital under the care of a physician selected by Elsie. By 4 in the afternoon, her grand jury defense had begun. Chapter 7. The prowler was real. There really had been a prowler on the property. That was the gift that the family lawyer recognized first. The fact that the prowler was real is the central fact that makes the Woodward case different from every other shooting of its kind in mid-century America. If there had been no documented burglar working the North Shore, no actual footprints on the lawn, no broken glass at the service entrance, the case would have ended at a courthouse in Mineola in February 1956 with a conviction. Anne would have served between 4 and 12 years for second-degree manslaughter. The 2 boys would have grown up as the sons of a convicted woman. The Woodward name would have absorbed the worst public disaster in its century of public life. Elsie would have buried not only her son, but, in a different way, the family she had spent 40 years protecting. The prowler was real. The footprints on the lawn were Paul Wirths' footprints. The broken glass at the service entrance was Paul Wirths' broken glass. He had been on the property at the moment of the shot. He had heard the shot. He had run. He would be arrested in November on unrelated charges. He would, when questioned, admit he had been there. He would say he had peered through the kitchen window and had seen the housekeeper. He had heard the shot and run. He had not entered the house. He had not been in the upstairs hallway. He had not killed Billy, but he had been there. Sol Rosenblatt, in the upstairs hallway of the Playhouse at perhaps 6:30 in the morning of the 31st of October, did not yet know that Paul Wirths existed by name. He knew, because Billy had told him during the buying of the shotguns 3 weeks earlier, that there had been a prowler problem in the area. He knew, because Captain Bauer had told him at the door, that there were unidentified footprints on the lawn and broken glass at a service entrance. He saw, in that information, the architecture of a defense. The defense was not that Anne had not fired. The defense was that Anne had fired in good faith. The prowler made the good faith plausible. The prowler was the architecture. The Nassau County District Attorney in 1955 was Frank Gullotta, who would later become a judge of the New York Supreme Court. Gilded was a careful man. He had not been the district attorney for long. He understood the social position of the family on whose property the killing had taken place. He also understood his professional duty. He would later say in the interviews given long after his retirement that he had treated the Woodward case exactly as he would have treated a similar shooting in any other house on the North Shore. The treatment was the convening of a grand jury, the presentation of the available evidence, and the deferral to that jury of the question of indictment. He did this in November and December 1955. The available evidence included the prowler, the shotgun instruction, the unanimous family testimony, the staff testimony, and Ann's 3 consistent accounts. It did not include any evidence that the marriage had been in trouble. The family did not produce that evidence. The staff did not produce it. The columnists did not testify. Marina Habe was not subpoenaed. The grand jury heard the version of the marriage that the family wished it to hear. The grand jury met in Mineola in the 3rd week of November 1955. It sat for several sessions over the following 6 weeks. It heard from Captain Bauer. It heard from the medical examiner. It heard from the Nassau County detective on the prowler case. It heard, by November of that year, from Paul Wirths himself, who confirmed he had been on the lawn. It heard from the children's nanny, Marjorie Fagan, who confirmed that Billy had given Ann the instruction to shoot at any unidentified figure. It heard from the housekeeper, Mrs. Rogers, who confirmed she had heard Ann calling out her husband's name in the moments after the shot. It heard from Ann herself. Ann gave her account in person, for the only time in the public record. She did so in tears. She did not break down. She gave the account as she had given it to the detectives 3 times in early November, with the same details, in the same order. The grand jury heard from Elsie Cryder Woodward. She came up from Manhattan in her car. She wore black. She had not lost her composure in any public moment since the morning of her son's death, and she did not lose it in the grand jury room. She testified that her son and his wife had been happily married. She testified that her daughter-in-law had loved her son. She testified that the family was united in its support of Ann. She testified that the shooting had been a tragic accident. She gave her testimony in the calm, even, well-bred voice of a woman who had been raised to deliver well-bred sentences under any conditions. The grand jurors, by the account of the foreman that later emerged in interviews, were moved by her composure. What the grand jurors did not know, because no one told them, was what Elsie believed in private. The protective machinery and the destructive machinery were the same machinery. Elsie was running both. She was running the protective machinery in the grand jury room. She was running the destructive machinery in her drawing room on East 72nd Street, where she had already begun, the week of her son's death, to plan the long, quiet exile of her daughter-in-law from the social world she had spent 12 years trying to enter. The grand jury saw only the first machine. The vote on the 27th of December, 1955, was for no true bill. The grand jury voted unanimously to refuse to indict Ann Woodward for any crime in connection with the death of her husband. Frank Gilded accepted the decision. He had presented the available evidence. He had not pressed for a result. He had done his work. The case was closed. The press response to the grand jury decision was the response of the press of the period. The New York Times reported the decision on the front page in a brief paragraph. The story was described as a tragedy. Ann was not named as a suspect. She was named as a widow. The Daily News and the Daily Mirror, the 2 tabloid papers of New York, ran more colorful copy. They referred to her as the Showgirl widow. The phrase Showgirl widow would follow her for the rest of her life. It was not, in 1956, intended as an insult. By the late 1960s, when it was used by the new style of celebrity columnist, it would become an insult of a particular kind, the kind that no court could correct. The press did not investigate the marriage. The press did not investigate Marina Habe. The press did not interview the staff at the Playhouse beyond the official statements. The press did not, in the language of the period, push. The press was operating in the last decade of the old protective culture, the culture in which families of a certain social position were granted, by quiet agreement, the right to have their private lives kept private. The Woodward case marks the late period of that culture. By the time of Capote's chapter in Esquire 20 years later, the culture had collapsed. In 1955, it still held. The press took the family's version. The press ran it. The press moved on. Ann sailed for Europe in February 1956. She was 39 years old. She had been a widow for 4 months. She had been acquitted by a grand jury of any criminal responsibility for her husband's death. She had been provided for by the Woodward family trusts in a way that meant she would not have to work for the rest of her life. She had 2 sons who had been taken into Elsie's care during the grand jury period, and who would now begin the slow process of being raised primarily by their grandmother in Manhattan rather than by their mother. She had no friends in Europe to whom she could go for comfort. She had not, in 12 years of marriage to a Woodward, made any friend who could have offered comfort of the kind she now needed. She went alone. She went to Switzerland. The first machine had finished its work. The second machine was just beginning. Chapter 8. The grand jury believes the family. A Nassau County grand jury does not sit alone in a room. It sits inside a community, and the community had decided. To understand how a grand jury delivered no true bill on the 27th of December, 1955, you need to understand the social and legal architecture in which it sat. A grand jury in New York State in 1955 was a body of approximately 23 citizens drawn from the voter rolls of the county. The Nassau County Grand Jury of November and December 1955 contained, by the records that survive, a banker from Hempstead, a real estate broker from Garden City, the proprietor of a small chain of hardware stores in Mineola, 2 housewives from East Williston, a senior office manager from a Long Island insurance company, the editor of a small weekly newspaper from Bayville, several others of similar profile. It was, in other words, an upper-middle-class jury from the suburbs in which the Woodward family was the most famous wealthy resident. None of these people had ever met Ann Woodward. All of them had read about her in their morning papers for several weeks. All of them, when they sat down in the grand jury room in November, had a fixed image of her in their minds. The image had been formed by the columns of Cholly Knickerbocker and by the front page of the New York Times. The image was of a beautiful, slightly frightened young widow, in mourning for her husband, supported in her grief by his mother. The image was almost the opposite of what was true. The grand jury also sat, in 1955 Nassau County, inside the older social fabric of the North Shore. The community on the North Shore in 1955 was a community in which the Woodwards were a respected, slightly distant, slightly inaccessible family of long standing. They had been at Oyster Bay Cove for almost 40 years. They had given to the local Episcopal Church. They had given to the local hospital. They had given to the local schools. They were known, in the way that wealthy families of long standing in a region are known, by reputation and at a slight remove. The members of the grand jury would not have invited Elsie Cryder Woodward to a dinner at their houses, but they knew her name. They knew her standing. They had, in many cases, donated to charities of which she was a patron. They were embedded inside a fabric in which the Woodward family was, by quiet agreement, treated as a family that would not produce a person who could murder her husband. The fabric was the community. The grand jury sat inside it. Frank Gulata, the district attorney, presented the available evidence with what those who were in the room later described as professional thoroughness. He presented the medical examiner's report. He presented Captain Bauer's investigation of the property. He presented the prowler evidence. He presented Marjorie Fagan, the children's nanny, who confirmed Billy's instruction to Anne about the shotgun. He presented Paul Wirths, who confirmed he had been on the lawn. He presented Elsie, who confirmed the marriage had been sound. He presented Anne, who gave her account. He did not present Marina Hobb. He did not present the staff entries from the housekeeper's quietly maintained notebook of bad nights. He did not present the European columnist's references to Billy's bachelor period in Europe. He did not, in short, present the second half of the marriage. The omission was not, by any contemporary account, a result of pressure. It was a result of the available evidence. The family had not produced the second half of the marriage. The staff had been instructed not to volunteer it. The columnists were not subpoenaed. Marina Hobb was in Paris. The district attorney's office, working with the evidence that was offered to it, presented what was offered. The presentation was, by the standards of the law of 1955, complete. By the standards we would now apply, it was missing the central context. The grand jury heard the presentation. The grand jury saw the prowler. The grand jury saw the shotgun instruction. The grand jury saw the unanimous family. The grand jury voted as the community had already voted. No true bill. The morning of the 28th of December, 1955, was cold in New York. The New York Times printed the grand jury's decision on the front page. The headline was a single line. The story was 3 paragraphs. The vocabulary of the story was the vocabulary of tragedy. The word murder was not used. The word killing was used once. The word accident was used 3 times. The story closed with a quotation from Sol Rosenblatt. Mrs. Woodward is, of course, grieving the loss of her beloved husband. The family stands fully with her at this difficult time. The Daily News, the Daily Mirror, the Herald Tribune, the World Telegram and Sun, the Brooklyn Eagle, all ran similar versions. The story was treated as the closing chapter of a tragic accident, not the opening chapter of an unanswered question. The closing was the family's strategy. The strategy had worked. The members of the grand jury returned to their houses on the night of the 27th. The foreman, a man named Howard Beaumont, who ran a small accounting practice in Mineola, was interviewed for a brief paragraph in his local paper. He said he was satisfied with the decision. He said he believed the family. He said the case had been a tragedy. Howard Beaumont would die in 1973. He never reopened the question of what he had voted for. None of the other jurors did either. The grand jury kept its decision and its certainty. The community on the North Shore moved on. The Woodward family, in the official record, had been acquitted of any wrongdoing. The official record was not what mattered. What mattered was the slow, quiet, persistent work of the social columns of New York in the months that followed. The columnists, by their own quiet agreement, treated the case as closed. They did not write about Anne's voyage to Europe in February. They did not write about her residence in Switzerland. They did not write about her absence from the spring season. They simply, in the columns where her name had once appeared, did not include her name. Her name had been Mrs. William Woodward Jr. Her name was now nowhere. The polite no, the form of statement Elsie had perfected, had become the form of statement of the entire New York social press. For Anne herself, the grand jury decision was the door that opened onto the rest of her life. She did not understand, in February 1956, that the door opened onto a different kind of room than the room she had thought it would open onto. She believed she had been freed. She had not been freed. She had been transferred from one wing of the building to another. The wing of the building she was now in was the wing in which Elsie ran the second machine. The second machine did not work in the courts. The second machine worked in the calling cards, the seating plans, the omissions, the failures to mention, the not received, the not invited, the not seen, the not named. The second machine had 32 years to run. It was, in the late winter of 1956, just beginning its work. Anne sat on the train to the port of New York. She watched the snow on the fields. She did not yet know what was coming. Chapter 9. The long exile begins. The grand jury had said no true bill. New York had said one word, never. The Switzerland Anne arrived in the late winter of 1956, was the Switzerland of the discreet private clinic on the lake at Geneva. The clinic she went to was Bellevue, in Kreuzlingen on the Bodensee, the same clinic at which Václav Nijinsky had been treated 3 decades earlier, and where many other women and men of her economic class had gone over the years for the conditions of the period: severe depression, nervous exhaustion, alcohol dependency, what was called melancholia. She arrived by train. She had brought one trunk. The fee was approximately $1,000 a month, the equivalent of perhaps $11,000 a month today. The fee was paid by the Woodward family trusts, on the careful instruction of Sol Rosenblatt. The instruction was that Anne was to stay as long as she needed. She stayed for 6 months. The treatment at Bellevue in 1956 included rest, careful diet, daily walks, weekly conversation with a physician, the available sedatives of the period, and the careful restriction of alcohol. Anne complied with the regime. She was, by all reports of those who treated her, a careful and thoughtful patient. She rarely spoke about the events of the previous October. When she did speak about them, she spoke about them with what the physician's notes described as a flat, controlled affect. She did not weep. She did not collapse. She gave her account, when asked, in the same words she had given it to the Nassau County detectives. The physician's notes, which survived in the family records but have not been made public, did not include any moment in which Anne admitted to having fired the shot in any state of mind other than fear of an intruder. Whether she was telling the truth at Bellevue is the central question. The physician's notes from a clinic of the period are not always a reliable record. The The medication of the period was sedating in a way that modern medication is not. The clinic culture of the period was a culture of restraint. A patient in Anne's position would not, in 1956, have been likely to volunteer anything that could later have been used in a criminal proceeding, even though no proceeding was contemplated. The family lawyer had instructed her to say nothing. She said little. What she said was consistent with what she had said in New York. She returned to New York in the late summer of 1956. She moved into the East 93rd Street house. The boys, by then almost 12 and 9, had been living for most of the year at Elsie's house on East 72nd Street and at Bel Air Mansion in Maryland. They returned to Anne. They were, by the accounts of those who saw them in those years, polite, careful boys who had learned not to speak about what had happened. Anne tried, for the autumn and winter of 1956, to resume the form of her life. She wrote to her friends, she accepted the invitations she received, she arranged small dinners, she bought the new clothes of the season. What she discovered in the autumn and winter of 1956 was the work the second machine had been doing in her absence. The invitations she had once received did not come. The friends she had once known did not write. The columns she had once appeared in did not mention her. Elsie did not see her socially. Elsie did not see the boys at Anne's house. Elsie saw the boys at Elsie's house. The arrangements for the boys' schooling, their summer plans, their visits to Bel Air, were made by Elsie and communicated to Anne by Marjorie Fagan or by a Woodward family staff member. Anne was being moved out of her sons' lives. She was being moved out slowly, gently, politely, but firmly. By the spring of 1957, Anne had understood the shape of what was being done. She did not have, in those years, the language to describe it as a strategy. She had only the daily evidence of empty invitations, unanswered letters, brief visits to the boys at school that were not extended into longer visits, requests for the boys to come to her for the summer that were politely refused on Elsie's behalf. She drank quietly. She drank in the East 93rd Street house alone. She drank in restaurants where she was now usually alone. She drank in the apartments of a small number of younger friends who had not been raised inside the social register and who could not understand, when she tried to explain it, what was happening to her. In 1958, she gave up the East 93rd Street house. She moved to a flat on East 70th Street. The move was a quiet acknowledgement that she could no longer occupy the family house. The boys would now come to her, when they came at all, at a flat with 3 rooms. The boys came less often. She also began to travel. She went to London, she went to Paris, she went to Rome. She did not stay anywhere. The flat in London was at first attractive to her, then less attractive, then exhausting. The Paris hotel rooms were the same. The Rome friendships were not, by her own admission to her one trusted friend, real. The friend was a young writer she had met in Paris who, in the early 1960s, had begun to invite her to lunch at his own apartment in New York whenever she was in town. The writer was Truman Capote. She had met Capote first in Paris in 1960 through Morella Agnelli. Morella had introduced them at lunch in the Rue Saint-Honoré. Capote had been 36. He had just finished In Cold Blood. He had been at the height of his social ascendancy. He was, by his own description, an avid collector of women. He collected women in the way that he collected fine furniture. He collected them for their stories, for their conversation, for the access they could give him to rooms he could not yet enter on his own. He had collected by then Babe Paley, Slim Keith, Morella Agnelli, C.Z. Guest, Gloria Guinness, Lee Radziwill. He had not yet collected Ann Woodward. He began to collect her on a humid afternoon in Paris in the spring of 1960. Anne did not understand at first that she was being collected. She believed she had made a friend. The friend was warm. The friend was clever. The friend was discreet. The friend listened with care to the details of her life. The friend asked questions. He asked about the early years in Pittsburgh. He asked about the radio in Kansas City. He asked about the Copacabana. He asked about the wedding. He asked about Elsie. He asked, with very particular care, about the night of the 30th of October, 1955. He did not press. He did not interrogate. He asked, and he listened, and he wrote nothing down at the time. Anne talked. She talked because she had not had anyone to talk to for 5 years. She talked for a long time. By 1962, she had given Capote, in the course of perhaps 20 conversations across Paris, London, New York, and the south of France, what was probably the closest version of her own account of the marriage she had given to anyone since the shooting. She had given it in confidence. She had given it because she trusted him. She had given it because he had told her, several times, that he understood her. She had given it because he had asked, gently and persistently, in a way that suggested he intended only to keep it close. He did not keep it close. He kept it in his memory and on private notepaper for 13 years before he used it. He used it, when he used it, in the most public way available. The years between 1962 and 1975, the long middle of Anne's exile, were the years in which the protective second machine that Elsie had built completed its work. Anne did not return to the columns. The boys grew up. Woody Woodward attended Groton, then Harvard. He became a journalist. He worked at the Washington Post and then the Wall Street Journal. Jimmy Woodward attended Groton, then Harvard. He was a quieter, less visible young man who, by the early 1970s, was working in finance in New York. The boys saw their mother. They saw their grandmother more often. Elsie continued to be, into her late 80s, the central figure in the boys' lives. Anne was a peripheral figure. She had been moved to the wing of the building that the family used for storage. She had been moved gently over 15 years. By the autumn of 1975, she was an almost invisible woman in a Fifth Avenue apartment who saw her sons perhaps 4 or 5 times a year. She still drank, she still traveled, she still read. She still occasionally accepted, with the brittle politeness she had learned to use as her last public manner, the smaller invitations that were now all she received. She was 60 in 1975. She had been a widow for 20 years. She had been told for 20 years, by the silence of the columns, the absence of the calling cards, the polite refusal of the dinner invitations, that she did not exist. She had absorbed the message. She had begun, in the privacy of her own apartment, to absorb the message as the truth. In the second week of October 1975, a buff-colored envelope arrived at her Fifth Avenue apartment. It was an advance copy of the November issue of Esquire magazine. It had been sent to her by an acquaintance who had been at lunch with the editor and had been told by him, with an expression he did not at the time understand, that Mrs. Woodward would want to see it before it came out on the newsstands. She opened the envelope, she turned the pages, she found the table of contents, she found the chapter title. She turned to the chapter. She sat down in the chair beside the window of her drawing room. She read. Were Chapter 10, La Côte Basque, 1965. She received the advance copy of Esquire on the 11th of October, 1975, and she sat in her chair and read it. The chapter was 18 pages long. It was titled La Côte Basque, 1965, after the restaurant on West 55th Street in which Capote had set the action. The structure of the chapter was a long lunch at the restaurant between Capote's narrator and Lady Ina Coolberth, who in real life was the British-born Slim Keith, Mrs. Leland Hayward, then Lady Keith. Over the course of the lunch, the two of them dissected, with the careful malice of long conversational practice, the secret lives of the people at the surrounding tables and the absent friends of New York society. The chapter contained 5 or 6 set pieces. One of them was about an Italian count and a beautiful young woman. One of them was about the wife of a New York governor and a stained sheet. One of them was about the wife of a Standard Oil heir. One of them was the Ann Hopkins story. The Ann Hopkins story occupied perhaps 4 pages of the 18. It was told by Lady Ina to the narrator over their second glass of wine. The story was as follows. Ann Hopkins, the narrator was told, was a beautiful, common, ambitious girl from somewhere out west who had married a young man from one of the oldest banking families in the country. The young man's mother had hated her from the beginning. The marriage had not been happy. The young man had taken a mistress in Europe. One night on Long Island at a country house, the wife had heard a noise in the hall. She had taken a shotgun from beside her bed. She had fired through a door. The figure on the other side was her husband. The mother-in-law had decided in the morning that the family would defend her. The grand jury had acquitted her. The mother-in-law had then spent the rest of her life ensuring that the daughter-in-law would never again be seen in a respectable drawing room in New York. The mother-in-law was a clever woman. The daughter-in-law was, the narrator was told, a frightened murderess who had once stood at the center of New York and now lived in a small apartment uptown and drank. The names had been changed. The names were called Ann Hopkins, David Hopkins, Mrs. Hopkins. The Long Island house had been moved a few miles. The shotgun had been changed to a rifle. The mistress had been given a different nationality. Everything else was almost as it had happened. The grand jury, the no true bill, the social exile, the drinking, the apartment uptown. Anne, reading the chapter in her own apartment uptown, understood, by the 4th page, that she was reading the story of her own life as Truman Capote had told it to Slim Keith over a long lunch. She set the magazine down. She stood up. She walked to the window. She looked out at Central Park. She was 60 years old. She had given this man her trust for 15 years. She had given him her story in confidence. He had taken it. He had told it. He had told it by November to perhaps 200,000 readers of Esquire. He would tell it, when the book version came out, to a much larger number. She also understood, by the end of the chapter, what was going to happen next. The columns would pick up the story. The columns had been waiting for 20 years for someone to give them permission to write about her again. Capote had given them permission. The columns would write about her. The friends she still had, the small handful of younger women who had not been raised inside the system, would not be able to protect her from the columns. The boys would read it. Their friends would read it. The college acquaintances would read it. The colleagues at the Washington Post would read it. The young women her younger son had begun to date would read it. The Woodward grandsons would read it. She made one telephone call that night. It was to her hairdresser to confirm an appointment for the next morning that she did not in the end keep. She did not call any of her remaining friends. She did not call her sons. She did not call Elsie, although Elsie was still alive at 92 and in possession of all of her wits. She did not call Capote. She did not write any letter to be found in the morning. She did not, by every account from the staff at her building, give any indication of what she intended. In the morning, the 12th of October 1975, her housekeeper found her dead in her bed. The cause was cyanide. She had kept a small file of it for some time, the way a certain kind of woman of her generation had been known to keep a file of it, against the day on which the world became unbearable. The day had come. She had used it. She was 60 years old. She had outlived her husband by 20 years almost exactly. The news reached Elsie on East 72nd Street within an hour. Elsie was, by then, almost completely deaf and only intermittently lucid in the way that women of 92 can be. She received the news from her secretary. She did not weep. She did not ask any questions. She did, by the account of the secretary, sit very still for some time. Then she instructed the secretary to place the funeral arrangements with the same firm that had handled her son's funeral 20 years earlier. She instructed her to pay for them. She instructed her to ensure that the boys were properly notified. She instructed her to ensure that the press release described the deceased as Mrs. William Woodward Jr. She did not, in any of these instructions, refer to Anne by name. The funeral was held 3 days later. It was small. Elsie attended, the boys attended, a small number of Anne's younger friends attended. Capote did not attend. Capote had spent the previous 3 days in his apartment in UN Plaza, refusing to take telephone calls. The chapter in Esquire had reached the newsstands on the morning of Anne's funeral. The reviews had begun. The reviews were mixed. The social fallout for Capote was already starting. Babe Paley had stopped speaking to him. Slim Keith was preparing to do the same. The Swans were leaving him. Elsie at the funeral spoke briefly to a friend in the back of the church. The friend was Aileen Mela, who wrote the society column under the name Susie. Maley would later report, in print, the line Elsie said to her in the back of the church. The line was, "Well, that's that. She's killed my son, and now she's killed herself. I guess we should consider it second-degree manslaughter." Elsie, then 92, having outlived her son, her daughter-in-law, 2 of her 3 daughters, and many of her closest friends, had finally rendered her verdict in the only court whose judgment she had ever truly recognized. The verdict was that of the second machine. The verdict was final. Chapter 11. The 2 Sons Who Followed. There were 2 boys upstairs in the house the night the shotgun went off. Neither of them lived to 40. Woody Woodward, the elder son, was 31 years old at the time of his mother's death in 1975. He had been 11 years old at the time of his father's death in 1955. He had lived, in the 20 years between, with the question of what his mother had done to his father. He had carried the question through Groton and through Harvard and through a journalism career he had begun in the late 1960s at the Washington Post. He had moved to the Wall Street Journal in 1972. He was, by the accounts of his colleagues at both papers, a careful, intelligent, slightly distant young man. He did not speak about his family. He did not invite questions about it. He had, in the 4 years before his mother's death, begun to write a long-form essay about the case for his own private files. He intended, by his own admission to a single close friend at the Journal, to publish it one day under his own name. The publication of Capote's chapter in November of 1975, and his mother's death in the same week, removed Woody's intention. He could not, after his mother's death, publish what he had been writing. He stopped writing it. He destroyed the manuscript in the spring of 1976. He returned to the routine of his journalism work. He continued to live in the Manhattan apartment on East 83rd Street he had occupied for several years. He saw his grandmother on the East 72nd Street roughly twice a month. He saw his younger brother Jimmy roughly every other week. He did not, in the year after his mother's death, see any of the women who had once been his mother's social friends. They were not invited. He did not seek them out. In the autumn of 1976, Woody became more visibly depressed. The colleagues at the Journal noticed. The desk editor noticed. The departmental editor noticed. He was offered by the management of the paper an extended period of leave. He declined it. He told the editor that the writing was the thing that kept him steady. He continued to write. He published several pieces in that autumn that were, by the assessment of his colleagues, the best work he had ever done. The pieces were about the New York financial markets. They were sharp, careful, and unsentimental. None of them touched on his family. On the 5th of November, 1976, Woody Woodward jumped from the 8th floor window of his apartment on East 83rd Street. He was 32 years old. He left no note. He had given his housekeeper, the previous evening, his careful instructions for the disposal of his small collection of books. He had paid his rent. He had set his affairs in order. He had taken his own life with the same careful, deliberate consideration he had brought to everything else. The funeral was held 3 days later. Elsie attended. Jimmy attended. The Journal sent a representative. The Post sent a representative. The press treated the death as the closing of a story that the readers of the columns had already partly forgotten. Jimmy Woodward, the younger son, was 29 years old at the time of his brother's death. He had been 7 at the time of his father's death. He had grown up in his brother's shadow. He had attended the same schools. He had attended Harvard. He had, by the time of his brother's death, established himself in a quiet career in New York finance. He worked for a small private bank. He kept his own counsel. He had married, in 1972, a young woman of careful Boston background. The marriage was not, by the accounts of those who knew it, a happy one. They had not had children. They had separated, without divorcing, in 1976. Jimmy, in the year after his brother's death, became, in the accounts of his colleagues at the bank, almost completely silent on personal matters. He came in, he did his work, he went home. He spent his weekends at his grandmother's house on East 72nd Street, reading in the room that had been his father's bedroom as a boy. Elsie at 93 was now physically frail. Jimmy read to her for several hours every Saturday afternoon. He read her Trollope. He read her Wharton. He read her, in the last weeks of his life, several chapters of an Edith Wharton novel about a young woman of the New York Social Register who is destroyed by it. On the 25th of June, 1978, Jimmy Woodward took his own life in his Manhattan apartment. He was 30 years old. He had used a method his brother had not used. He had left, in his case, a brief letter to his grandmother. The letter, which his estate's lawyer kept and which has never been made public, was reported by Aileen Mela, who spoke to the lawyer at the funeral, to consist of 3 sentences. The sentences expressed his love for his grandmother. They expressed his regret. They expressed his hope that his grandmother would forgive him for ending the line. The line he was referring to was the Woodward line. It was now over. Elsie at 95 outlived both her grandsons. She died in 1981 in her own bed, in her own house on East 72nd Street, attended by the staff who had attended her since the 1940s. She had been, by then, almost completely blind for 2 years. She was buried beside her son and her husband at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. Her funeral was attended by the surviving members of the New York Social Register of her generation. By then, a small and diminished group, The columns reported her death with the kind of respect that is reserved for the last members of a dying social formation. The phrase that was used most often was the end of an era. The Woodward family trusts that had been created for the boys were closed in the years after Jimmy's death by the lawyers of the firm of Rosenblatt and Wall. The Bel Air Stud had been closed in 1957. The East 93rd Street house had been sold in 1960. The Maryland estate at Bel Air Mansion had been sold to the city of Bowie in 1964. The art collection had been dispersed. The thoroughbred bloodline of Nashua continued in the broader racing world, but no longer carried the Woodward name. The Woodward name in American banking had been absorbed by successive mergers. There was, by the early 1980s, no longer a Woodward family at the head of any institution. There had been one in 1955. There was none in 1985. The 30 years that contained the shotgun blast in the upstairs hallway of the Playhouse had been, in the end, the years in which the family the Woodwards had been at the center of New York had been quietly, gently, completely closed. Chapter 12. The Verdict Society Never Reverses. There are two verdicts in every old money story. One of them is delivered in a courthouse. The other is never delivered out loud. The legal verdict on Ann Woodward was delivered on the 27th of December, 1955, by a Nassau County grand jury. The verdict was no true bill. The verdict was that Ann Woodward could not be charged with any crime in connection with the death of her husband. The verdict was the most powerful verdict the legal system of the state of New York could produce. It was the verdict that no future prosecutor could overturn. It was the verdict that no future court could revisit. It was the verdict that should, in the official record, have closed the matter. It did not close the matter. The matter, in the only court whose judgment she came to recognize, was not closed for 32 more years. The social verdict on Ann Woodward was delivered on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1943 in the bedroom of a townhouse on East 72nd Street when Elsie Cryder Woodward read a private investigator's report once, then twice, and then went into her son's bedroom and told him that the woman he had brought home was not for him. The social verdict was confirmed, with no further work needed on Elsie's part, by the omission of a wedding announcement in the New York Times in June of the same year. The social verdict was renewed and re-entered into the record week by week, year by year, season by season, through the 12 years of the marriage, through the morning of the 31st of October, 1955, through the closed wing of the Manhattan Eye and Ear Hospital, through the testimony before the grand jury, through Switzerland, through the empty drawing rooms of 1957 and 58 and 59, through the small apartment on East 70th Street, through the years of London and Paris and Rome, through the lunches with Capote, through the publication of La Côte Basque, 1965, in November of 1975, through Ann's death the day before the magazine reached the newsstands, and through Elsie's line at the funeral and the lawyer's quiet closing of the trusts after the boys were dead. The protective machinery and the destructive machinery, this is the central truth of the old money story, are the same machinery. They are run by the same people. They are operated through the same instruments. They depend on the same code. The code is silence. The instrument is the calling card. The currency is the seating plan. The reward is access. The punishment is omission. The machinery has been operated in New York and in London and in Paris and in Newport and in Palm Beach for 150 years. It has been operated, in the period of this story, by women like Elsie Cryder Woodward, who understood every part of it and who never had to raise her voice once in 32 years to use any of it. She raised her voice once, very early, on the Tuesday morning in 1943, when she said to her son in the bedroom that the woman was not for him. She did not raise it again. She did not need to. What does the case ask of us, 50 and 70 years on? It asks us to look carefully at the difference between the legal verdict and the social verdict, between the official record and the actual life that record produces, between the protective machinery that a closed system extends to one of its own and the destructive machinery that the same closed system runs at the same time against the same person. The protective machinery saved Ann from prosecution. The destructive machinery removed her from the world. The two machines were the same machine. The two operators were the same operator. The wing of the building she had been moved into was the same building she had been moved out of. She did not understand this until the very end. By the time she understood it, the door was closed. Capote understood it. He had been studying the building for years before he wrote about it. He understood that the second machine had never been written about in public. He understood that his swans were the operators of the second machine in his own time. He understood that to write about Anne was to write about all of them. He wrote about her. He wrote about her because she was the easiest of them to write about. She was, by 1975, already half outside the building. He told her story. He used her real life as material. The swans understood at once what he had done. They understood that if he had written about her, he would write about them. They closed against him. He was destroyed by them. He died 9 years later in Los Angeles. He had been thrown out of the building. He had not understood, while he was inside it, that he was as expendable as Anne had been. The building does not keep its favorites for long. The case also asks us about silence. Ann Woodward's life was the story of a long silence that closed around her from her wedding day in 1943 onward. The silence was not the absence of words. The silence was the absence of names. Her name in the columns of New York, after the brief and reluctant year of 1953, slowly disappeared. Her name in the seating plans of the drawing rooms slowly disappeared. Her name in the family conversations of her sons slowly disappeared. By the early 1970s, she had become a woman who lived in an apartment uptown whom certain people had once known. She had become, in the language of the second machine, an omitted person. The omission was the verdict. The verdict was final. No grand jury was impaneled to deliver it. No newspaper announced it. It was delivered by the cumulative weight of 30,000 small individual choices, not to mention her, year after year, made by a few hundred people in a few hundred drawing rooms. The case asks us finally how many other women like Anne are still inside that building. The building still stands. The drawing rooms have moved addresses. The social register no longer has the visibility it had in 1955. The grand juries are not what they were. The columnists are different. The press is no longer in the protective compact it was in during the Woodward years. But the second machine is still operating. It is operating in the seating plans of certain dinners in Manhattan and Greenwich and Palm Beach. It is operating in the membership decisions of certain clubs. It is operating in the careful management of certain family reputations. It is operating in the patient long-term punishment of women who marry up and are never forgiven for it. It is operating quietly. The omission is still the form of statement. The omission is still the verdict. Behind 1,000 polite locked doors, the second machine still runs. Ann Woodward was buried beside her husband at Woodlawn Cemetery. The graves are close. The headstones are simple. The dates are the dates of 2 American lives that had been at the center of a closed world for 1 full generation, and then had been moved by the operation of 2 simultaneous machines into the long silence at the edge of it. The legal verdict freed her. The social verdict killed her. They were the same verdict. They were rendered by the same court. The court has not yet closed its session. The shotgun in the upstairs hallway of the Playhouse on the night of the 30th of October, 1955, is not, in the end, the central instrument of this story. The central instrument of this story is a calling card that was not sent in the spring of 1943 by a woman in a townhouse on East 72nd Street who held the card in her hand for a long moment and then put it back into the drawer. If you stayed with me through all of that, subscribe so the next of these old money stories finds you when it lands. And tell me in the comments where you are watching from and what you think really happened in that upstairs hallway on the night of the 30th of October, 1955. Was it the prowler? Was it the